Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the webinar. So this afternoon, we're going to start looking into the World Bank's Scaling Solar Programme to have a look at the success there. Okay, so Chris, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thanks, Joe, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone that's listening to the webinar. We hope it's interesting. To give you a little more background on Blue Horizon and myself, I am the founder of Blue Horizon, and we specialize in advisory and customized research on the clean energy sector. I've been working in the energy industry for over 10 years, the last 7 of which has been based in South Africa, where I'm currently speaking to you from. I should also mention that this project is done in collaboration with GTM Research and Ben Attia, who's also going to be speaking to you after my presentation. So here's just a brief outline of what we're going to be discussing today. Mainly it's discussing a white paper that GTM Research and myself co-authored on the Scaling Solar program that's been administered by the World Bank Group. I'll cover some of the achievements and challenges of the program and compare it to other procurement approaches for context. And then Ben will pick up where I've left off to discuss some of the future outlook and opportunities from the Scaling Solar program going forward and summarize some of the lessons learned from the white paper. And you can also, I should mention, you can also access the full white paper on GTM Research's website. So feel free to reach out to them if you can't find it after searching for it online. So the Scaling Solar program has initially focused on the African markets. There's a large opportunity in Africa identified here by the Africa Development Bank of 160 gigawatts of on-grid renewable energy needed by 2025. And an additional 75 million off-grid connections just to meet the universal energy access goals that the AFDB has set. So there's significant demand, significant resource, and even a lot of capital available. Sometimes too much capital trying to chase too few projects in this market. So I guess it raises the question of why haven't more projects been built to date, and why are we behind schedule on meeting some of these energy access goals. And I've listed here a number of the recurring challenges that I've seen in working in the market here over the last few years. The biggest one of which is probably the gaps in regulatory support and institutional support for the renewable energy industry. Another big one is off-taker credibility of local utilities here. Specifically in Zambia, we have a utility that has a lot of downward pressure from government to reduce its tariffs and keep electricity affordable. While that is beneficial for ratepayers, it does create challenges for utility to be perceived as bankable and as a credible off-taker for some of these power projects that are kind of waiting in the wings to be built. Another common challenge that we're currently experiencing in South Africa are competing procurement interests for other power projects. South Africa has started its renewable energy procurement program back in 2011, and to date have procured over 60 utility scale projects. Most of those were built on time and on budget. But over the last couple years, the round 4 for the procurement program has been delayed, largely due to the utility not wanting to sign new PPA contracts with round 4, and also the competing procurement of government, who would rather have its nuclear projects built as a higher priority than bringing more renewables onto the grid. So that's just one example of where we see other procurement interests coming into play and making it a challenging market to operate in. But fortunately, there are solutions, and the World Bank Group is working on some of those solutions, as we'll see on the next slide. Yeah, so solutions do exist to some of these challenges. While they can be a bit daunting, there have been a number of projects in South Africa that have been built on time and on budget using a transparent auction approach. And the Scaling Solar program by the World Bank Group tries to leverage some best practices of solar auctions. They also offer some turnkey advisory and standardized contracts for these projects to add some more credibility to the program. So it's not just the local government overseeing the procurement process, it's also the World Bank Group. Also the governments that they tend to work with for scaling solar have limited capacity to oversee these programs on their own. So they also add help in reviewing bids and adding transparency throughout the process. So ideally, these projects are supposed to take about 2 years from concept to implementation. The Zambia project at round 1 is taking a little bit longer than that, so 2 years may be a bit optimistic, but we'll get into that in a bit more detail later on. But as a whole, these projects use a public-private partnership structure where the IPPs are responsible for construction and operation of the plants, the governments oversee the procurement process, and ultimately help facilitate the offtake agreements with the local utility. The World Bank Group also is able to leverage a number of support products to address some of the challenges that were discussed previously. Some of these support products include the advisory services we discussed that the IFC is involved throughout the procurement process to make sure things run transparently and on time. World Bank Group also does some upfront screening of sites and initial feasibility and due diligence to ensure that the site selected meet minimum requirements. MEGA provides political risk insurance for these projects, and the developers were probably happy that they had that insurance given the recent state of emergency that's been declared in Zambia. But the political risks in Zambia aren't the biggest issues there. It's actually the bigger issue is probably the off-taker credibility of the utility, and the partial risk guarantees offered by the World Bank help to address that, fortunately. And the financing provided by the IFC also helps to ensure that these projects can remain competitive and sell electricity at competitive rates. So the biggest achievement to date of World Bank Group's Scaling Solar program has been round 1 in Zambia, where they've seen the lowest tariffs on the continent at the time of procurement back in 2016. It also demonstrated that the Scaling Solar program can attract a lot of international competition with over 48 bidders who responded to the initial RFQ and 11 shortlisted to respond to the full RFP for just 2 projects. The 2 winning bids right now are in the financial close phase. They're a little bit behind schedule, but we'll touch on that, I guess, in the next slide. Yeah, as I mentioned, round 1's taking a bit longer to reach financial close than expected, but it's been a learning process for all the parties involved. Allegedly, there's been some challenges with the site assessments that were done on the sites in Zambia, creating some extra challenges, but it sounds like ideally financial close will now happen closer towards the end of this year for one of the projects, and maybe in the first quarter for the second project. So as I mentioned, it's a learning process for the IFC, and they're incorporating some of the learnings from round 1, including the longer timeline that may be required into the future scaling solar programs that are being rolled out in Ethiopia, Madagascar, and Senegal, as well as round 2 in Zambia. It's also helpful for context to compare the Scaling Solar program to other procurement programs in the region that have tried a different approach and not gone, have not worked with the World Bank Group. So for example, Botswana had the option to work with the World Bank Group on Scaling Solar, but decided to take its own approach and put a RFQ out for a 100 megawatt project and received over 150 bids for this solar project. The small government in Botswana, though, has limited capacity to review that many bids, and they had to seek outside help for reviewing those bids, which is still underway, and many have said much less transparent than the scaling solar program had been run. In Namibia, there's another example of a country that decided to go forward with its own procurement program through a feed-in tariff for solar PV, about at 5 megawatt project caps. Well, the project was successful, and it did sign projects for 13 solar PV and 1 wind project. The market rate at the time of procurement was about 17% above the same project sizes that were being procured in South Africa at the same time. So this procurement process highlights the challenges when government tries to set the prices through a feed-in tariff, as opposed to using an auction approach, which is done with the scaling solar program, where the private sector sets the price. And lastly, we've touched on this already, but South Africa's renewable energy procurement program has now been delayed for over 2 years, despite some initial success in the first few years of its operation, and is dealing with some wavering government support at this stage. So to end off, I think at least my section, I think the World Bank Group Scaling Solar Program has realized a number of positive achievements and is using some best practices in procurement, which is a step in the right direction. But to really make sure that the industry is sustainable, the countries that World Bank is working in also need to make sure they're practicing good governance and putting in long-term regulatory support to make sure the industry is sustainable over the long term. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Ben, who's going to speak more about some of the future opportunities of the Scaling Solar program.
Thanks, Chris. That was really interesting. Just while I swap over slides, anyone that wants to get in touch with Chris, you'll see his contact details at the bottom of the screen here. So now I would like to welcome Ben Attia to the webinar. Ben joins us from GTM, and Ben, you'll find the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Joe. So it looks like everyone can see my slides, which is great. I'll just thank Chris for a great presentation and an awesome collaboration on this project and others that we're working on as well. My name is Ben Attia. I am a research analyst on our global solar demand team at GTM Research. So I focus on particularly emerging markets in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and India, trying to understand both on and off-grid solar market development and trends in the space. So next slide, please. A little bit about GTM Research. So we're the leading market analysis and advisory firm studying the transformation of the global electricity industry. We study solar, grid edge, and energy storage. And we're also part of a larger company called Wood Mackenzie that studies gas and power markets, as well as our sister company, Make Consulting, which studies wind markets. So we're building sort of a global renewables practice and kind of our ability to understand the entire market from end to end. So what we do is we have a research and advisory and consulting firm. We put on our own conferences to kind of understand the events that are going on in the space. And then we've got a news site, which is greentechmedia.com, which many people know us for, which gives some analysis on the space as well. So that's a little bit about us. Feel free to check us out or reach out to me personally with my email at the end of the website, at the end of the presentation. So just a little bit on context for the Scaling Solar program. We do 5-year outlooks on basically every solar market in the world. And for the sub-Saharan African region, we see pretty strong growth coming in the next 5 years. So between 2017 and 2022, we expect the market to grow from about 800 megawatts to over 4.3 gigawatts. A total cumulative capacity significant of over 12 gigawatts installed, led, of course, by sort of a diverse region or diverse group of countries in the region, in large part driven by the Scaling Solar program. So of those capacity expectations that we have for the region. About 1.3 or 1.4 gigawatts of that we expect to be driven by Scaling Solar's existing engagements. So if we were to sort of assume a reasonable schedule and the IFC's 2-year timeline for projects that have been participating in the program, we expect about 113 megawatts to come online in 2018, mainly in Zambia. 2019 will see 665 megawatts of solar capacity come online. And in 2020, we'll see about 550 megawatts. This is, again, only under the 4 existing engagements in Senegal, Ethiopia, Madagascar, and Zambia. And their cumulative targets are shown there as well. Currently, the IFC is in negotiation with up to 12 other countries to set up Scaling Solar tenders under some advisory mandates. And this is happening not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Central Asia and Southeast Asia as well. So this is something that we do expect to see a much larger trend in the global market and emerging economies for this program to proliferate. But right now, it's currently only existing in these 4 markets. There's also the possibility that many countries that are in negotiations with the IFC for the Scaling Solar program may not end up participating, but could engage with the IFC for other sorts of concessional financing offers and similar risk mitigation products that Chris was talking about, just not part of this program. Next slide. So in the countries that are currently participating, we see that there's a significant portion of total installed electricity generation that's going to be added to meet rising electricity demand growth. So in each of these countries, Madagascar being a slight exception, there's at least 22%, up to 30% of total existing generation capacity that's going to be expanded as a result of Scaling Solar program engagements. And currently, all 4 of these countries have open engagements. Zambia is in round 2, the shortlisting process for 12 IPPs, which have been shortlisted for the 300 megawatt round 2 project. And then in Madagascar, Senegal, and Ethiopia, there are open RFPs and pre-qualification processes that are going to be closing in the next couple of months in each respective market. So in Zambia, which is the only project that's completed bidding so far, as Chris mentioned, we're seeing that the projects are a bit behind schedule. As under the original program schedule, they should have been due to interconnect in May 2017, but to date, neither project has reached financial close. As Chris said, we do expect that to happen by the end of this year, early next year, so we could expect to see both of these projects interconnect at the end of 2018. However, in addition to these low prices, the Scaling Solar program is advertising sort of this rapid 2-year timeline from the execution of an MOU through on to project operation. This target has kind of been realized by the IFC to be a bit aggressive or unrealistic in some of these emerging market contexts. It's been a learning process, as Chris said. And part of this has been due to limited capacity in local governments, such as Zambia's and also in Botswana, though outside of this program. They essentially expected sort of a 90-day process to be completed for due diligence, and which ended up taking about 6 months. And part of that, we believe, was due to a sort of land procurement and way leave dispute with ZESCO, which is the Zambian utility. So they're just kind of working out some kinks there with the site assessment and trying to understand if the bids are sort of still viable in that context. But our estimates show that the project site costs are between $1.11 US per watt and $1.18. So that actually looks quite competitive, especially in an African context. The capital stack for the Enel project looks to be quite heavily public capital financed. So there's an 87% debt to equity ratio, and there's 3 $13 million loans coming from the IFC, Canada's climate change program, and then the European Investment Bank offered a $13 million parallel senior loan. We expect that the rest of the project cost, which is about $45 million US dollars, will be an 80-20 split equity in the special purpose vehicle, which is owned by Enel Green Power and the Zambian IDC. So you can see also in the bottom left that there are 12 bidders who've been shortlisted for round 2. And we expect that this program will continue to move forward. And it's been suggested or sort of highlighted that the state of emergency in Zambia that was recently declared has sort of highlighted the value of the risk mitigation offerings that the program offers. But we are still seeing that the 2-year timeline is panning out to be quite unrealistic, at least in this sort of initial stage of the program. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to do a quick poll. So there's been some discussion around sort of the impacts on the local industry of the Scaling Solar program. And Chris and I, in our white paper, sort of dove into that topic, but we'd like to see what sort of our participants think. So our options here, does the enabling environment of the Scaling Solar program inhibit local industry? First choice is yes, the program's enabling environment offers unfair benefits to large vertically integrated competitors and discourages local industry. Second choice B, yes, but only because it sets a price benchmark local developers cannot compete with. Third choice C, no, local developers operate in different market segments and are therefore not affected by international IPP bids and program options. And fourth choice D, no, local developers are able to use precedent from Scaling Solar projects to apply for similar assistance from multilateral development banks, demonstrate to off-takers the viability of the technology, and et cetera. So I'll just give maybe a 30 seconds or a minute to collect some votes.
So in terms of the results, we've got 31% who said A, yes, the program's enabling environment offers unfair benefits to large vertically integrated competitors and discourages local industry. The most popular answer was B on 33%. So yes, but only because it sets the benchmark for pricing that local developers cannot compete with. C got 20% and D got 16%.
Great, thanks, Joe. Great, yeah, so Chris and I would sort of generally seem to agree, although it is definitely a sort of a split issue here. Both of the winning consortia, both led by First Solar and Enel Green Power, suggest that the program represents a valued mechanism, significant opportunity, but we did speak to some Africa-focused developers who view the program maybe in a less positive light. And I just want to caveat this by saying that we don't believe that the program is in fact sort of killing or hampering local markets in quite the way that others might feel, but we have sort of weighed these sort of pros and cons on what this does to expectations elsewhere in the region. So we do believe that there's a sentiment among Africa-focused developers that the Scaling Solar bid did sort of create a low price expectation for developers that are operating outside of the enabling environment of the Scaling Solar program. We do believe that this does invite large international IPPs to have the potential to dominate some of these solar markets, and that some people believe that it's sort of the expectation of a coming Scaling Solar MOU may sort of stall or hamper other development. But we also argue that there are plenty of other market drivers and segments, including DG, for local developers to participate in, that the Scaling Solar program is not crowding out at all, and that there's strong value in having the precedent and experience of large IPPs enabling a local market and creating initial relationships with utilities and sort of demonstrating the value and use and cost effectiveness of solar. So we do agree with the assessment that it has been limiting developers elsewhere on the continent because some of these developers have decided difficulties with regulators expecting similar benchmark prices or holding out on approving project licenses because of an expectation that there may be a coming MOU with the Scaling Solar program. But as Chris mentioned, there are a number of other market drivers in the region. There was a successful manpower tender in Namibia. Botswana's auction was heavily oversubscribed. And a refit program funded by KfW in Zambia is also helping to procure about 200 megawatts of additional solar by 2022. So we do see that there is sort of an ability for the market to thrive and exist on the back of the Scaling Solar program, but that maybe in the short term, some other utility scale projects or negotiations with other utilities may set expectations that are not entirely founded, but do in fact exist. If we can go to the next slide, we'll just continue that conversation a bit. Yeah, so what we're trying to sort of think about here is do the benefits of the enabling environment of the Scaling Solar program that attract large IPPs, does that sort of give an unfair advantage to international vertically integrated participants? And Chris and I want to just make sure that we remind the audience of the program's actual goal, which is not to enable local industry, but to quickly procure competitively priced de-risked solar projects for governments that are participating in the program. So offering stapled financing, risk mitigation, due diligence, and custom advisory services sort of enables that and attracts the interest of large players that have access to cheap debt and can build at lower cost than perhaps oftentimes lower than local industry. But looking at the long-term maturity of this market, the regulatory framework, the ease of doing business, the current and future demand growth for electricity, and supply constraints and dependence on imports will have a huge impact on the growth of the utility scale solar markets, far beyond the sort of limited engagements of the Scaling Solar program, which will serve to unlock those markets. There's also the possibility for local developers to look for other differentiators. Local content requirements are a great example there. That would allow them to sort of compete in a separate market segment than international IPPs who are looking to build. And we acknowledge that competition in international utility scale auctions is here to stay. And it actually does better serve the needs of both the participating governments and the IFC Scaling Solar program itself. But the key point here is that in the short term, there may be some sort of confusion and unmet expectations by other developers who are operating in parallel to the Scaling Solar program, but the solar industry is not a zero-sum game. And it's highly possible and highly likely that other local developers will be able to corner other market segments or see the utility scale markets unlock after the Scaling Solar engagements are complete. Or have been sort of resolved and financially closed as the utilities look to procure additional solar from local partners. So if the initial projects can demonstrate that solar can be procured competitively and built on time, this improves the perception of the technology in the region and enables further growth. We do expect that this competition will continue with or without the Scaling Solar program. So for local manufacturers and installers and developers to be able to adapt and build on the back of the Scaling Solar program is highly possible and likely. So let's wrap up here with some lessons learned on the next slide. So some lessons from the first round of the Zambia auction. The IFC is looking at adjusting the timeline of the program to be a bit more generous in lead times for engaged governments, creating some more concrete requirements around land ownership and land-related environmental and social issues to sort of alleviate the problems that happened with the Wayleave dispute with ZESCO in the first round, and perhaps to create some more customized pre-qualification criteria to address some issues with PE firms who were sort of structurally precluded from participating in the auction because they don't have a certain number of gigawatts of installed capacity experience and other sorts of structural requirements like that might open up the program a bit. On the local market, as we were just discussing, the solar market is not a zero-sum game. We have seen that there's been some additional red tape difficulty for developers in markets where the program is in place or potentially under negotiation that have created some difficulties between developers and utilities looking to move forward on projects. But there are plenty of other market segments, differentiators, and sort of precedent building that the Scaling Solar program doesn't participate in and creates at the same time, which will allow them to participate in the market. The other option is always to participate by forming consortia with larger players and moving into the space that way if they want to participate in the program auctions directly. And lastly, on sort of this benchmark price issue and what this means going forward, we do believe that for better or for worse, it probably shouldn't, but the perception in the market is that the Zambia bid does seem to sort of represent a benchmark expectation. But our view, as we said, is that the solar market and the industry is not a zero-sum game. So as the program expands, setting realistic price expectations with off-takers and regulators in advance of the program will help if the program does arrive to sort of understand what costs look like in specific markets and to not generalize sub-Saharan African region as a single marketplace. So what we conclude is that the program does represent a breakthrough risk mitigation and advisory mechanism that will lead to over 1.2 or 1.3 gigawatts of competitively priced solar in these 4 markets, as well as the potentially much more that will come from the 12 markets that are under negotiation now across the developing world. In places where there is political stability, committed national governments, and the grid capacity and infrastructure needed, the program does provide an important nudge. to allow competitively priced solar to be procured, and to encourage experienced developers to enter markets where they may not have otherwise done that. And it gives the government experience with procurement best practices. As we've seen in Zambia, there is sort of a separate program that is spun out of the Scaling Solar program that will procure, as I said, an additional 200 megawatts of solar by 2022. And that's kind of largely building on the lessons of the Scaling Solar program. However, on the long-term side of things, because nothing has actually reached financial close or been built yet, the jury is still out on sort of the long-term successful implementation and replicability, as well as the intended and unintended market impacts. It's still a little bit yet to be determined what this will actually mean for the Zambian market and for the rest of the sub-Saharan African market, as we haven't seen any projects actually move forward in a significant way. But we do believe that will happen, and we believe that the interest from the 12 other governments suggests that the program is valued from a public perspective, and our assessment of the round one winners suggests that the program is valued by international IPPs, the likes of the ones who won the first round. So we do expect the program to grow and to continue to proliferate and include more additional markets across the world. And as a result of that, we do expect to see it driving multiple gigawatts of solar installations going forward. And we'll be keeping our eyes on the impacts on the rest of the market and on the developers who are participating as well. So I think now we'll move into a time of Q&A. So Joe, the best way to facilitate that would be great.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, both of you, Ben and Chris. As Ben said, we have a little bit of time for questions now. So I can see some questions starting to come through in the chat box. But if you have a question for either of our speakers, now is the best time to put them to the speakers. We'll also send slides around to everybody after the event. So you should be able to have a look at the speakers' slides, and I can see both speakers put contact details on them, which is great. So in terms of questions that we've had so far, what are you seeing in terms of the different technologies driving one another? So you know, we've got solar PV, microgrids, and storage. How much are you seeing being driven by the kind of the option to have now, you know, different technologies supporting projects in the region?
So the question is on other technologies that may be introduced, not just solar PV, but maybe storage or other enabling technologies. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at the kind of interplay between PV, microgrid, storage, and kind of how technology is moving on, what are you seeing from that perspective in terms of what's driving what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think a good example of that is maybe in Senegal, where they've done a procurement program to auction off licenses by region for companies to provide off-grid services for customers in those regions. So it's a similar kind of approach, but looking at it from the perspective of energy access and off-grid solutions for remote areas, not just utility scale projects. But you can also imagine a similar procurement program with storage if you wanted to, for solar PV, run the same way and administered either by government or with the help of the World Bank Group. I know South Africa has looked at this specifically for the Renewable Energy I4P program, where they did include storage for some of the technologies that were procured.
Sure. Okay, and we have a question from Nigeria. So Bello Bamali, he's asking, as a mini-grids developer in Nigeria, currently on a pilot project, is there anything that the Scaling Solar program can do for project owners there?
So, I mean, I think unless the Scaling Solar program signs an MOU and creates sort of the setup of the program in Nigeria, not directly, no, but there are definitely some lessons and other risk mitigation and financial support products that Chris spoke about that are available regardless of the participation in the Scaling Solar program or not. And that would basically create a sort of a de-risked enabling environment for attracting additional global utility scale developers. But if the Scaling Solar program is not active in that particular country, then no, there's nothing that could be done at the time. And Nigeria perhaps is one of those 12 countries under negotiation. We'll have to wait and see.
Cool. And obviously in Nigeria, the government's done quite a lot to try and offer guarantees for projects. So, you know, that could be a country where we see kind of projects starting to get built over 2018, I guess.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Chris, a question for you. So at the beginning, you mentioned a need of, for sort of highlighted that need is 160 gigawatts, and the scaling solar pipeline is around about 1.2, 1.3. How much of that big gap do you see the program filling, and how else might we be looking at scaling up projects in the region? That's a big question, isn't it?
Well, yeah,
no pressure.
The goal of the Scaling Solar program, I think, is to pass on best practices and to show the benefits of this auction program and how it can work. So the Scaling Solar program can't roll it out for 160 gigawatts. It's not possible, but it's supposed to be a demonstration of what works, and then governments can run from there and take those best practices and apply them.
Yeah, and just to build on that, something that I was trying to sort of communicate in my presentation is that the Scaling Solar program is designed to unlock these markets and to attract large developers who are interested in participating in markets where they may not otherwise participate because of the inherent risk. But as Chris and I argue in this paper, what we're hoping to see is that the Scaling Solar program will enable other development outside the program and other policies outside the program as well, which is what we started to see in Zambia in partnership with KfW. And we expect to see that happening after the program starts to move forward in some of these other markets as well, is that there will be spin-offs of, hey, well, now the regulators understand what this looks like to actually create a market that is competitive procurement or has sort of a sort of risk mitigated environment. And now we can create that on our own outside of the Scaling Solar program and potentially include the IFC in those projects or not. But the fact that there would be sort of lessons learned and best practices that could be reapplied outside of the program's context is something that we expect to see, and that's sort of the intent of the program as well.
Sure. I've had two very similar questions, which I'm going to wrap into one. So two questions really around Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. I mean, what kind of scope do you think there is to roll this out over a wider geography beyond Africa?
I mean, I can start there too. I think for us, we know that the IFC is negotiating with countries in that region. We know that the IFC is negotiating with more countries in sub-Saharan Africa as well as in Central Asia. So the likelihood of it happening in the Southeast Asian or South Asian region is highly likely. I think in those particular markets, a number of those countries are already building their own competitive procurement programs. So they may borrow some lessons, but it's unlikely that they would develop those sort of initially and then bring the Scaling Solar program alongside in parallel. At least in my personal opinion, that doesn't seem to be a very sort of likely solution or scenario. But I do think that in markets where there is no sort of central procurement mechanism or an FIT-based market, which historically Bangladesh and Nepal have been, that's changing in both of those contexts. But in places where there's been an FIT-driven market or no sort of centralized procurement mechanism, I definitely do see sort of ripe fruit for the Scaling Solar program to enter the market.
Sure. Okay. And in terms of the kind of benefits beyond access to power, what are the measures for kind of social impact in terms of kind of measuring success of projects, do you think?
I can take that one. Beyond the access to affordable power, the goals of this they didn't set any localization targets within the Scaling Solar program. So unlike some of the other procurement programs we've seen in South Africa and the region, there are localization requirements and local employment requirements. But even without those restrictions in the Scaling Solar program, it's still expected that the construction companies will definitely have to source labor during the construction process for most of these projects. There will be some short-term labor there, but the longer-term operations and maintenance support and localization from that will probably be less because it's not a requirement of the procurement program.
Okay. We had a question looking at the kind of off-grid market. So what, if anything, do you think it can be done to kind of attract smaller kind of off-grid projects, or maybe even encourage commercial off-takers, so kind of large energy users, companies that have operations in the area, to start working with developers and investors, do you think? Do you see it remaining as a large-scale PV program, or do you see it kind of widening in terms of technology reach?
Well, I think the enabling environment, I tried to highlight this in my presentation, but the enabling environment is really key to not just unlock utility scale, but also to put in regulations that allow for developers to install on-grid electricity as well as off-grid solutions, and providing certainty if someone is going to build a microgrid, be connected and to the main grid in 10 years or so, providing certainty in terms of regulations when they apply for the license. What's going to happen to that infrastructure that's already been installed? Will the utility be forced to buy that electricity at the agreed rate, or will that project no longer be able to compete and have to go out of business because the utility can provide electricity less expensively? So these are questions that need to be discussed and answered at the regulatory level, in addition to utility scale projects that are we're looking at here.
And I think from my perspective, what's interesting to me is if you look historically at top-down energy procurement programs for on-grid solar, utility scale solar, or any other energy technology for that matter, there's a very different marketplace that's created in a top-down way versus a sort of a bottom-up grassroots market. And top-down energy access historically has mainly looked like national grid extension programs. Bottom-up energy access looks much different. That's an organic market that starts with low-tier electricity and grows from there. So I think there are not too many lessons for the Scaling Solar program for top-down electrification. Because the sort of growth of that market is fundamentally different for off-grid solar. I think that's sort of the opposite approach.
Sure.
There are lessons for regulators and for policymakers to create an enabling environment, and policy is huge for both mini grids and for distributed generation and DRE solar. But in the off-grid space, the enabling environment is just sort of the first linchpin or the first thing to get things started. But those are definitely bottom-up markets.
Okay. One of the things that you touched upon in your presentation was the amount of applications that followed the program. I mean, do you think this program is kind of giving enough support to governments to be able to understand, what is being proposed, what's being connected to the grid, what projects like solar PV can and can't do, and to really kind of understand how to get the best out of the developments that are kind of being applied for in the different countries?
All right, Ben, do you want to take that one, or?
Why don't you start?
Yeah, I guess it's difficult for this program to solve all the problems, or not just, but to answer all the questions about what governments need to do or to grow the utility scale market. But it is just an example of one of the pieces of the puzzle that's required to have best practices in procurement and an approach that lets the private sector set the prices and allocates risk appropriately for these projects to make sure you can get affordable electricity and reduces the risks for both developers and the governments participating.
Sure. And Ben, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just add there briefly. I think the value of this program is to create a de-risked environment that allows participating governments to quickly procure de-risked low-cost solar projects, right? That's the stated intent, and that's that's the actioned intent in reality as well. And I think that the lesson from that is, what does that look like in other contexts? What can governments, policymakers, and regulators do to create enabling environments for solar at all pieces of the market, on-grid, off-grid, mini-grid, solar home system, distributed residential, utility scale, everything, right? So those lessons apply. The sort of scale and scope of sort of a multilateral development bank program's participation looks very different in each of those contexts. But I think that there are definitely universal lessons across the board. But Chris is right. The program is not going to solve all these problems. There needs to be sort of institutional buy-in. There needs to be appropriate electricity demand, existing infrastructure. And that's why there's negotiations with only certain countries. Where is sort of well suited for an intervention like this, and where has sort of taken matters on their own and built a competitive procurement model on its own, or in other places where is it the case that the market is not ready, or the existing infrastructure is not ready for a large-scale utility solar project. And those are questions that are important and that the IFC has been asking themselves and answering as they've been in these negotiations with other countries. So yes, there are universal lessons, but they only apply in contexts that are sort of well-suited or appropriate for the intervention.
Sure. And I guess that brings us to the last question that I'm going to run through this afternoon. So we have a lot more questions to get through, but I don't think we can finish them all. But crystal ball time, gentlemen. So Carsten wants to know, after Senegal, Zambia, Madagascar, and Ethiopia, which do you think are the next likely countries that the World Bank Group will enter with the Scaling Solar Programme? And I guess that touches on which countries look ripe for this kind of development, which you just touched on.
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I knew, but I think if you look at what these countries have in common, you can probably guess about where World Bank is targeting its next Scaling Solar Program. I mean, these countries tend to have pretty good governance, pretty stable politically for the most part. They tend to have low capacity to do it all on their own. They're not the size of South Africa or Nigeria that has a bigger government that could run a program like this potentially without support from the World Bank. So looking at countries that have similar characteristics from that perspective, and maybe Ben has more insight into his crystal ball than I do.
Well, it is a crystal ball. So can't say that I've got anything more than speculation, but there are a few countries in West Africa and in Central Asia that seem to be sort of ripe for this. I can think of Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. I can think of potentially Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or some of the other markets that have expressed interest in solar but haven't gone anywhere quite yet. I can see Mongolia potentially. And then there's definitely a lot of interest in Southeast Asia, where there's been a significant amount of interest, but also a significant amount of regulatory uncertainty. So I know that there is interest from the IFC and the World Bank in a number of markets there as well. So of course it's speculation. Of course, we don't know, but I can say with some level of information that I think there is interest in sort of markets that corner those sort of qualities that are necessary for the program to thrive. And we've done a little bit of work to try to understand where those places might be. So yeah, happy to have more chats about that with people who are interested. You have my email address on the slides. Feel free to send me a message. We'd be happy to chat, Chris and I, on some of these topics. And yeah, we'll have to wait and see how the program develops and see where these negotiations start concluding and start going places. And it'll be really interesting to see how it impacts local industry and what it does to developer interest internationally as the program starts to take off in new markets as well.
That sounds good. And I guess maybe next time we speak, we can go through some of those markets perhaps. Thank you, gentlemen, both for your time preparing the slides. As they both said, Both Chris and Ben have put their contact details on the slide decks, so I will send them around shortly in the next couple of days to all attendees, and you can contact Ben or Chris directly. If you'd like to get in touch with me at Solar Media, my name is Joanne. I'm running the event that we're hosting in Tanzania in December, Solar and Off-Grid Renewables. If you'd like to have more information about the event, just contact me on jwilkinson@solarmedia.co.uk to find out more information. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope to see you soon at the event or on a forthcoming webinar. Many thanks.